the What Really Happened radio show. Because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. And I understand the phone line that we're using, for some reason, has a very long delay, so you're going to have to bear with us. Could be some momentary gaps between questions asked and answered. But joining us on the air right now is Joe Banister, runs the website Freedom Above Fortune. And Joe, it is a treat to have you here on the show. I don't imagine there are very many people who don't know who you are and what your story is, but I'd like you to start out, for those people who just got out of the monastery, telling us your background, how it was you came to leave the Internal Revenue Service, and just take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks very much for having me. You can hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Very good. Well, almost 50 years old, and graduated from San Jose State University way back in 1986. And during the late part, 80s and 90s, was basically in the private sector, working my way up the chain as an accountant, a certified public accountant, eventually a controller of a venture capital firm, and thinking I was going to, be in the private sector accounting world for the rest of my life, the rest of my professional life. But it wasn't too long, only a couple of years into that career, when I realized there's just no way that I could keep on doing that kind of work and remain sane. It was just way too boring for me. So meanwhile, I had a lot of relatives and friends who were in law enforcement, and I decided that what might be a better pathway for me would be to use my financial skills in a law enforcement capacity. And so I went ahead and applied to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Both of those agencies have what they call special agents or criminal investigators. It's a GS 1811 series criminal investigator for the federal government. And the FBI application went along fine, but there was a hiring freeze in the Department of Justice at that time, and I couldn't get hired, even though I had qualified for a position. Meanwhile, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division called me in the summer of 1993 and asked me if I'd be interested in a position with that agency. And, as people that are older, like myself, maybe in their 40s or 50s or older, remember that the FBI had at least prior to Waco and all those things, had a lot better reputation. And so I really had my heart set on the FBI, but because of the hiring freeze, they couldn't hire me. And the IRS was calling me, and so the idea grew on me, shall we say, because they did get into money laundering investigations and drug investigations and working on their own. They're considered by all agencies the premier financial investigative agency in the world. So it was, even though to the public, the IRS is a nasty agency, the career path kind of intrigued me. So I went ahead and accepted this offer of employment, and in November of 1993, I was sworn in as an IRS special agent. And when I say sworn in, because like every federal government employee, we are administered an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And from that very day of taking my oath, I was very mindful of the oath that I had taken. So I worked all through 1994, 1995, 1996. First 3 years of my career at the IRS were very exciting. I flew all over the country on investigations. This was pre-9/11, so I'd fly armed on the airlines.
Okay, Joe, I hate to cut you off.
Yeah.
I hate to cut you off, but we're coming up on a commercial break, so hold that thought about flying across the country and all the investigations. And when we come back from these commercials, we'll just pick up the story right where you are right now.
U.S. Steel, 21st Century Fox soundbite. Gives a damn what's true or false, long as it leans to the right. Add a token liberal, pretend I'm fair. I've been before some sex appeal. I'm busy oiling up the corporation wheel, and they call me U.S. Steel.
and aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We are speaking with Joe Banister from the website Freedom Above Fortune. And Joe, you were regaling us with your adventures as a criminal investigator for the Internal Revenue Service. And could you just pick up the story where you left it off?
Sure, Mike. Thank you. Just to put it into a nutshell, really was enjoying my career, not because I was some power-hungry, bureaucrat. But I was doing high-level financial investigations, sometimes jointly with other federal agencies, and really going after bad guys. For the first 3 years of the 5.5 years I was there, then I was listening to a talk radio show where the guest basically was talking about the federal income tax being a scam, fooling the large majority of the American people as to what their income tax obligations were, and about the monetary system and the New World Order. And, this is back in the late 90s, so it really hit me like a truck between the eyes. Normally I would have dismissed what she was saying on the show, but the host was, a very honorable guy named Jeff Metcalf. And so I thought, well, I'm going to look into this because she can't be telling the truth about the income tax because, my entire professional life revolves around the income tax. But yet, why would she be on this show if she was a charlatan? So I spent the next 2 years, basically all of 1997 and 1998, off-duty, evenings and weekends, looking into these claims that she made about the federal income tax. And she pointed to various researchers, some of whom may have been guests on your show or you've mentioned, Bill Benson, Bill Conklin, Larry B. Kraft, many more. And I just spent 2 years on a fact-finding mission, kind of a personal investigation, using my investigative skills that I had received from the IRS and my own training as an accountant, CPA, and really expecting to find holes in these claims about the income tax. And after that 2-year period, I found that she was absolutely right, that the IRS, the Congress, really the entire federal government is lying to the American people about the extent of their income tax obligations, and that they're, by doing that, are basically stealing from the American people. And I decided, having taken that oath to support and defend the Constitution, being told by the commissioner of the IRS that we're supposed to report any kind of fraud, waste, or abuse that we might encounter, I began to make inquiries and ask my supervisors to answer my questions about the application of the income tax, the administration and enforcement. And when I went to my immediate supervisors, they refused to answer any of my questions, and they invited me to resign from the IRS. And I had a very good reputation up until that point, and I really felt that the only way to preserve that reputation was to resign, because the longer that I stayed, the longer it would have given the IRS bureaucracy time to manufacture, things against me and ruin my reputation, and then no one would believe me. So on February 25th, 1999, I resigned from the IRS, and basically ever since then, I've been speaking about the issue when invited. I don't make a living at it, but I've got a unique story. Very few, well, actually no other IRS special agent, had gone to the trouble I did and then spoke up about it and lost my job over it.
Well, I think what's interesting here, first of all, it's obvious you're a man of integrity. And integrity is definitely a hindrance in the modern world. Back in the 1990s, I think probably a lot of people would have had trouble believing what you were saying, even with all the other people that were on, like the Jeff Metcalf program. But right now, of course, the United States of America, the American people understand, especially because of that debacle over Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. We now know the government lies to us about all kinds of things. They're still screaming about global warming, even as we have yet another record-setting winter. And so the idea that the government lied to us about the income tax applicability to ordinary citizens, about the ratification of the 16th Amendment, people are willing to listen to that right now, and especially as we're in this enforced austerity, where the taxes are going up and the spending is being...
Mike, I lost you. Still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I guess my question basically is, do you find that people are listening to you, willing to accept what you're saying today versus 1990s?
Yeah, actually, it's a very good point, and it's really quite amazing, as I'm sure you've experienced yourself, to live through a period like this where you, at first, you're kind of the Lone Ranger, and then you just keep on telling the truth, and it's amazing how over time more and more people come on board because it is the truth, and that it separates the men from the boys, so to speak, because people that aren't willing to live by the truth or speak about the truth are never going to come on board. But there's plenty of our fellow Americans out there and people around the world who want to know the truth and want to live by the truth and want their government to live by the truth as well. So I've been quite encouraged by the ramp up in the population of people who want to know the truth and live by it.
Well, would you tell us a little bit more about Bill Benson and his work on the 16th Amendment and the subsequent court order to try and silence him?
Certainly. Well, I encountered Bill back when I was still working for the IRS and was told that he had solid evidence of the lack of ratification of the 16th Amendment, and he was able to prove, to my satisfaction, that indeed it was not ratified according to the requirements, excuse me, of the Constitution. And he sent me some of his original documentation, which I thought was quite amazing, given that he had never met me and didn't know if I was just, surreptitiously working a sting operation on him or something. So he placed his trust in me, and I believe that I honored that trust. But the basic story is that Bill traveled to each and every one of the 48 contiguous United States, which were in existence back in the 1910 time frame. And the Constitution requires that for there to be a constitutional amendment added to the Constitution, 3/4 of the states in existence at the time must ratify the amendment. So 48 states would mean that 36 states would have to ratify the 16th Amendment. Well, Bill went to each and every one of the state legislatures and the state archives for each state and gathered up all the documentation from each state to prove that many of the states either rejected the amendment when the federal government thought that they had ratified it, or that the states ratified a version of the 16th Amendment that wasn't the same as what was proposed by Congress. So, Oklahoma was one example. Kentucky was the most egregious example, where they voted 22-9 to reject the 16th Amendment, yet the federal archives indicate that the Kentucky ratified the amendment. So the Kentucky documents show we reject the amendment. When you look at the federal archives, the feds say, oh, they accepted it. But California, Oklahoma, each state has its own story about how it either rejected the amendment or ratified language that wasn't what was proposed by Congress. So one way or the other, they did not follow what needed to be followed to, this very specific guidelines that have to be followed in order to ratify an amendment. Because, of course, you don't want to just willy-nilly, add language to a constitution. So the requirements are very strict, and they didn't even come close. So I would encourage people to look up, Bill Benson and his work. Now, as you said, though, since then, the federal government has done everything they can to discredit Bill's work, to silence Bill, so he can't even talk about the fact that the 16th Amendment wasn't ratified. The federal government trying to, poo-poo or minimize the impact of the fact that the federal income tax has been a bastard child since its inception. And all I can tell people is it's still a fact, and it still should be talked about. However, whether or not the 16th Amendment was ratified, the Supreme Court has ruled over and over again that the 16th Amendment did not expand federal taxing power, which is another critical factor that the American people need to keep in mind. So I don't like to get wrapped around an axle, about the 16th Amendment, whether or not it was ratified. It's important to show that it wasn't, but even if it was, the courts have ruled that it did not expand federal taxing power. So the American people need to examine, well, what are the limits to federal taxing power? So the issue is fascinating, and I think it's very foundational. People can then learn about the relationship between direct and indirect taxation, what the limitations are on the federal government's ability to tax indirectly, as with an excise tax, or directly, as with an income tax. And direct taxes have to be apportioned among the states. Clearly the federal income tax is administered, it's carried out as if it was a direct tax, because there is no middleman. It's the federal government directly relating to individual citizens.
Okay, Joe, we have to take another commercial break. We're going to be 3 minutes of commercials, and then we come back, and I'd like to get into Stanton versus Baltic Mining in a little bit more detail. And we'll be right back after these words from our sponsors.
I remember when I lost my mind. There was something so pleasant about that place. Even your emotions have an echo in so much space. And when you're out there without care, yeah, I was out of touch. But it wasn't because I didn't know enough. I just knew too much.
Welcome back to the show. We're speaking with Joe Banister. And Joe, I'm going to make a couple of comments up front and then let you go because this 2-second delay makes a dialogue virtually impossible. Back in 1895, the United States Supreme Court, in a case called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, ruled a direct tax on personal income was unconstitutional. Now, in the U.S. Supreme Court decision Stanton versus Baltic Mining, as you mentioned already, the Supreme Court said that the 16th Amendment did not, in fact, grant Congress any new taxing authority. And so if a direct tax on the income of real and personal property is unconstitutional and void before the 16th Amendment, then it has to still be unconstitutional after the 16th Amendment. So would you care to pick up from there?
Well, you're exactly right. I would encourage people, if they go to truthattack.org, that's the website founded by attorney Tom Cryer, who passed away last year. But Tom would walk the reader through that analysis to be able to see that the federal government's taxing power is extremely limited, and it's only over the decades of dumbing down of all of us and avoiding even discussing the issue is the reason that most Americans are unaware of those limitations. So I encourage people to go to truthattack.org and look at the law library section where it goes through, just like you said, talking about the Pollock case and how the limitations of the federal government were very well recognized, especially by the court. And it's only over the last 50 years or so where there's been this extreme control exerted over the media and over academia, where, you know, the average American is in the dark about just how limited the federal income taxing power actually is.
Well, I'm putting up a link right now to Truth Attack for the readers to look at. But I think at this point we're sensing so much anger in the American people. They know they're being lied to. They're seeing a government that routinely flaunts the law and the Constitution. I'm sure you're already aware there are these trial balloons coming out of MSNBC and the New York Times saying it's time to completely get rid of the Constitution because all those rules about, you know, civil rights are just getting in the way of everything. But as Americans all across this country are struggling to make ends meet, I think we need to make the point that every penny of money that is taken from you as a tax on your wages and salaries is done so fraudulently, that you have been robbed under false color of law. And, of course, another argument that we talk about all the time is originally the income tax was supposed to be on profit. But if you are trading 40 hours of your life in exchange for wages and salaries, is there really any profit, or is it a zero-sum deal? It's a swap of two items of equal value.
You're exactly right, and that's, you know, people think that income is everything under the sun, like the IRS claims that it is. But, you know, look at the definition of income. Look at the court cases, the Supreme Court cases that say exactly what income is, and that a gain has to exist. And how does someone gain from trading 40 hours of labor for 40 hours of pay? It just doesn't happen. So I couldn't agree more that people are getting upset. I discourage people from taking on the IRS one-on-one because the IRS is so nasty, doesn't obey the rules. So I would be careful, you know, that people not jump out of the frying pan into the fire. The IRS, if they can, they'll just take your money whether you like it or not. And that's whether you let them withhold from your paycheck, you know, whether you comply with their edicts or not. So I would encourage people to learn, listen, you know, talk to people who are honorable in the tax movement and try to understand the landscape, educate themselves before they change their, you know, the way they deal with the IRS. But I would encourage people to look because I think, as you mentioned, the government's going to keep on squeezing. There's going to keep on being these austerity measures and the fiscal cliffs and all these excuses to fleece even more money out of your already drained wallet. And so people better educate themselves very rapidly as to how the landscape works so that they can protect themselves and their family. Certainly as much property as you can keep in your own hands, such as in the, you know, gold and silver, you're going to be better off than keeping your property with some third party who will turn it over to the government in a heartbeat.
Well, basically at this point, we need to basically educate America that what the federal government and the IRS and the Federal Reserve are doing isn't really legal. They're operating on the same moral level as the sheriff of Nottingham's thugs, wandering the countryside and simply grabbing pigs and chickens whenever they feel like it. And I think the first step to really affecting a social change in this country is for the American people to understand it isn't the law what they're doing. We need to deny the government the illusion that what they do is moral, just, and legal, and it absolutely isn't. We have to take another commercial break here. Joe, can you stay with us for one more segment?
Sure, Mike. Thank you.
All right. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're finishing up with Joe Banister, former IRS criminal investigator, founder and operator of the website Freedom Above Fortune. I've put up a bunch of links, as we've been talking about, so you can go and check out Truth Attack, The Law That Never Was, and take a look at this. And what Joe was saying about not going head-to-head individually with the IRS, unfortunately, sadly, is true. because you need to understand all the courts and all the judges and all of that law enforcement, they are funded by tax revenues. It's a clear conflict of interest. You know, any judge whose salary comes from tax revenues really should not be making any decisions in these tax cases, but they do. And by the way, they all know it's a fraud. There was a very famous case, Sullivan versus United States, in which the judge James C. Fox states right in the court record that on examination, the 16th Amendment failed ratification. And it was just this huge scam. The 16th Amendment was declared ratified in 1913, the same year that the Federal Reserve Act was passed. Should have taken a constitutional amendment to transfer the government's money creation authority to a privately owned bank. But I guess having had as much problems as with the 16th Amendment as they had, they decided not to take the risk of trying to get another amendment through and just did an end run with that vote. But the whole purpose of these discussions about the legality of the income tax is not to encourage people to go out on this Don Quixote quest against the IRS, but it is to educate the American people that every penny taken from you for the last 100 years in personal income tax was stolen from you. You were cheated out of that money. It was not legal. It was simply taken from you to make the rich richer and to make you poorer, because remember, if you're being kept poor, that keeps you helpless and unable to stand up to the government when it goes off and does some of these horrible things that it tends to do. Joe, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, just to reemphasize your point, Mike, that if the government is lying to us about something as near and dear as the money in our wallets and our bank accounts, that they're willing to steal money from us or defraud us out of our hard-earned money. But that means that it's not going towards our children and our families and our ability to be charitable and help our neighbor. There's just so many wrong things that occur because of this lie. So I would just reemphasize the points you're making, that it's not a good idea to take them on one-on-one. There's plenty of information that needs to be looked at first before you decide what you're going to do about it. But it's a fact. The government is lying to you about your income tax obligations in almost every case, and you need to start looking to see how the government's lying to you so you can put a stop to it. And of course, we need to grow our numbers. More and more Americans need to learn that this is the case, rather than lampooning and maligning those of us who are telling the truth. And going back to what you said earlier in the program, that it's encouraging to see that we've been out here yelling in the wilderness for quite a long time, and people are starting to see that, oh, you're right. This is really the truth. So I'm encouraged by that.
Well, we can fight this in the court of world opinion, which is obviously the path that I'm choosing to take here. And as we talk about an American people ready to break free from all the lies and deceptions, obviously the first part of education is to get them to understand that, yeah, the government is lying to you, it's abusing to you, it's not treating you like human beings deserving of dignity and respect. It's simply an endless series of scams. And again, because of the lie about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, Americans, by and large, are now far more willing to acknowledge and accept that the U.S. government has gone rogue, that it is not serving the American people, that it's just another greedy bunch of money junkies grabbing the money they can from the people any way that they can. And part of it, of course, is the inevitable result of our private central system of banking. It's the very same sort of banking system we fought a revolution to be free of, but by design it's always going to create more debt than money to pay that debt, so the debt trap is permanent and inescapable. And I think more and more Americans have come to understand that the government is not here to serve the people, it's here to serve itself. And we need to basically work at destroying that illusion that this is somehow a government that is concerned with the well-being of the United States of America and its people. Like it says in the preamble to the Constitution, common defense and the general welfare, but one need only look around at the deteriorated conditions of our nation to realize that the general welfare has been abandoned. They're already talking about in Congress trillions of dollars in new taxation. At the same time, they're screaming about cutting funding for education, for social services, all the things that we would be willing to pay legal taxes for are being ignored, and the money is funneled into Wall Street bailouts and endless wars of conquest on other nations to try and force them back onto using the dollar and prop up this little Ponzi scheme a little bit longer.
I couldn't agree more, and I really commend you, Mike, for your efforts, because just look at the top of your website, where you have all the different ways that the government is lying to us. And, I still believe we need government, but we don't need government that lies to us, and we don't need to accept it. We have to police our government. There's no one else that'll do it for us. And so I really commend you for what you're doing. And I'm so happy that you could, have me on the show to talk about this.
Well, thank you very much for spending time with us today, and I hope more and more people are going to come over to your website. I know I'm getting some email from people who want to communicate with you privately about their conflicts with the Internal Revenue Service, and with your permission, I'm going to send over a couple of phone numbers for you to look at. But it is a major issue, and again, standing one by one, you don't have a chance against the IRS because the courts are funded from tax money. There have been some notable exceptions where, especially in jury trials, have come back and said, yeah, there's no law. But they are the rare exception. But when 300 million Americans come to understand that this whole IRS banking system cabal, syndicate, is operating outside the Constitution and outside the law and outside the rulings of the United States Supreme Court, they're not going to be willing to stand and support the government against the people. And that is really the most important thing that you can do. So please take what you learned here today, go over to Joe's website and Bill Benson's website and all these other things. Educate yourself about the letter of the law and the Constitution and share it with everybody that you know. And they're going to be afraid to think about it, but they need to think about it because it is all a gigantic, almost 100-year-old scam on the American people to benefit the bankers. Joe, thank you very much. We're going to let you go here because I know you got some other things you need to get onto. Hopefully we'll have you back on the show in the very near future.
All right, Mike, and thanks for putting up with the audio. You take care of yourself. Thanks for the invitation.
You got it. Thanks an awful lot. All right, that was Joe Banister, former IRS investigator, a man of obvious integrity, when he discovered for himself that the system was imposing taxes on people that the law does not allow to have taxes imposed on. He took a stand. It cost him his career at the Internal Revenue Service, and he resigned. There's a man of principle there for you. And I'm not the only one saying so. I'm getting all these emails. Joe is a modern-day hero, and he absolutely is. Because especially in a corrupted culture, being a person of integrity and principle, you very often do stand alone. He's absolutely right about that. But again, the good news is, especially in the wake of the lies about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, Americans are saying, we don't trust anything the government and the corporate media tells us anymore. And they're going back and they're looking at things they were told were true by the public schools, by the government, by the media. And they're re-examining them. And they're finding out it's nothing new. The government's been lying all along. Torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin, Spanish mine in Havana Harbor, and on and on and on. We have a government that rules through illusion and fraud and deception. And they pay lip service to the Constitution, but they're not following it. Now they're openly talking about, we just got to get rid of that thing here.
Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third.